Hello there everyone, I'm Christina of CSLdesigns, and in today's video I'm going to be focusing on wire kumihimo. And what I'm going to be doing is going through the basics of my method of doing wire kumihimo and also giving some tips and tricks. So this will hopefully be the ultimate guide both in relation to my book, Kumihimo Wire Work Made Easy, and also in relation to other tutorials that I have. So I have had some questions from people that have the book here just about basics and how to say get an even tightness and make sure the braids get nice and tight. So what I thought I would do to make it easiest, I do explain it in the book, but obviously it is hard to convey that kind of thing through text. So what I thought I would do was make basically an overall video to help give all the basic information and tips and tricks visually that I can the best possible way. Now obviously the ideal situation is doing it face to face, but obviously that's not quite possible, so I thought this was the next best thing. So what I also thought I would do with this video is put timestamps in the description box below the video there for the different instructions, you could say, or tips and tricks that I'm going to go through, because it might not be everything that you're struggling with, it might be something specific that you're struggling with, so you can just go down to the description box and find that specific thing. And obviously in the description box as well, I will also leave link to my book if you don't have it already and you're interested. And also just to know, I actually have a few for sale myself of signed copies in both my Etsy shop and on my website. I'm also going to leave links to that in case you're interested in a signed copy of the book. But anyway, enough talk, let's just get straight into it. So the first thing I'm going to go through is setting up your wires correctly so we can then add them to the disc and start braiding. Now what I have here are some lengths of wire prepared. So these lengths I'm going to be using to make a braid with. I have 6 lengths. Doesn't matter how many you have, I use the same method here. So what I do is first of all I make sure my wires are straightened, which I kind of do from when they're still on the reel. Obviously you can still straighten them out when they're off the reel, but just so they're nice and straight, they don't have kinks and bends in them. It's fine that they have curves, so if it has a large curve, it doesn't have to be stick straight, but just ideally get rid of any kinks and bends. And then what I like to do is, in this case here, got these 6 lengths, and then we need to find a way to kind of hold them together so we can add them to the disc and have like a starting point. So for that, what I do is use insulation tape. That's my preferred tape to use because it is sticky enough, because you can get some other tapes where they're not as sticky, but I find that that's actually not good enough. But afterwards you can still, the residue from this tape you can get off the wires, so it's not something to worry about too much. But then what I do is go in and cut off just a little piece of the tape. And obviously depending how many wires you're using, it could be a bigger or a smaller piece of tape. But then I have that ready. And then I just get my wires back and I make sure the ends here are even. And now I do this a little bit different depending what I'm going to be doing, but I'm just going to attach the tape first of all. So I always leave a little bit at the end of the wires there. I place the tape just behind while I'm kind of holding the wires in place, just so they're laying flat next to each other basically. That's what I'm aiming for. And then I'm just gonna basically wrap this tape around while the wires stay lined flat. So as you're wrapping, just kind of push the wires down. So they stay flat next to each other. So something like this, just wrapped around a few times here. Now this is the point where I have 2 different methods from here on, more or less. Now I can just line these up if I need to. It's not too crude, it doesn't have to be perfect or anything. But I use 2 different methods, and it depends on the design itself. Because if I'm just doing a braid where I'm going to end up finishing off the ends, say using ribbon ends, so I'm going to cut off the excess where I've already made the braid, so somewhere up here, cut through the braid, and then I'm going to add a ribbon end with glue. In that case, I use one method, but if I need to use the ends of the wires here, incorporate it into the design, I'm using a different method. So just to show you what I'm talking about, in my book here I have a few examples. So here is a bracelet where I made the braid and then I cut through a part of the braid to obviously get the length that I need, and then I added ribbon ends to the ends of the braid and glue inside as well. And in that case, it doesn't really matter what you do to the ends of the wire, so down here from the tape and below, but I am going to show you what I do, in just meaning that it doesn't matter how messy it gets because you're going to cut it off anyway. But if we then move on to a design where I need to use the ends to help finish off the braid in some way, you can see here this ring that I made. We got the braid going all the way around as the ring band, but then the ends of the braid are weaved in to the braid itself. And to do that, I then use a slightly different method. Also, an even better example here actually is the cabochon that I made, because this is the front of it, but if I show you how the back looks, you can see here these wires holding the cabochon in from the back are actually the ends of the wires in the braid. So that's why they're coming from the ends of the braid there and then crossing over on the back. They're being used, so all these wires are only the wires used to make the braid with. So that's why we obviously don't want them to have loads of kinks and bends, and we do want to be mindful of how we're handling the ends in some of these situations here, so if they're going to be incorporated into the design or finished off with the ends. So that's why I use two different methods. So firstly, if I'm using the ends incorporated into the design, I'm just going to show you that first. Basically, I leave it like this because that ensures that the wires stay straight, and obviously we're not adding extra kinks and bends into them. Now, the problem with that is it's a little bit fiddlier to handle, because if I just get a disc out here and show you, then I would then take this end with the tape on, put it down through the hole in the middle there, and then we need to start distributing them. Now, like I said, the problem with this method is you have to be a little bit more mindful. Bring that down, because what can happen more easily is the wires get pulled out through the tape. So basically, this is only the beginning of making the braid. We need to worry about that. So basically that means I am holding on to this, basically the tape in the beginning, around this end of the wires with my fingers underneath the disc, and basically you need to grab really tight, because as you're moving the wire, just as an example, in the first few rounds until we have a little bit of braiding done, as the wire is being moved, it easily pulls up through the tape, as you can see. So that is kind of the problem a bit with this method, but that's why you need to just make sure you're holding on tightly to the wires underneath there, and just the first couple of rounds just move the wires up here gently, so we don't pull too hard on the wires and then therefore pull them out through the tape and obviously all the way out of the project. So you could say that is the problem with that method. If I just take this back out, but I do use that if I need to use the ends of the wires. So I'm just going to straighten these back out again. And obviously, depending on how long lengths you would need for the project, for instance, for the ring that I showed you in the book, the ends don't need to be left that long down here, but for the cabochon, the ends were left quite long because they needed to be used for quite a bit more than the ring itself, and obviously for part of the decoration on the back as well. So again, it does depend on the design itself. Now for the designs where I don't need to worry about leaving the ends intact, you could say, because we need to use them, that does all of a sudden get quite a bit easier. All I do, the only difference is up until here it's the same, but I then take some chain nose pliers or flat nose pliers, and I have this short end below the tape of the wire sticking out, and I literally just grab them, because the whole point of this is just to make it a little bit easier to make the braid and prevent the wires basically from pulling out in the beginning. So I just grab all the wires at the same time and literally just bend them over on themselves, back over the tape. And then obviously this means now that I can't just grab a wire and pull it out. So when we start using our disc here and start making the first few rounds of the braid, you don't need to worry about the wires getting pulled out in the same way as when we didn't bend these wires over. So for designs where you don't need to use the wires, this is what I always do to kind of avoid having that issue. So next I'm going to go through attaching the wires to the disc before we can start braiding. So I have my wires ready here that I need to attach, and here I've got my bend in them, so I don't need to worry so much. Now of course I need to put the end with the tape down through the hole in the center of the disc, and then on the back of the disc it's going to be sticking out a little bit, and this is what I grab onto with one hand, and then I have the wire sticking straight up for now, and the top of the tape is kind of flush with the top of the disc itself. That's kind of just how it works out for me. Now to distribute the wires, I also have a bit of a certain way that I do that. It's not too crucial, but I do kind of like to just do it. But also for certain designs where you want to, mainly the ones where you're using the ends of the wires as well, you want kind of the whole part of the braid to look nice. So that means here I have 8 lengths of wire, so I need to have 4 on the top and 4 on the bottom. I'm going to be doing the cross kumihimo braid for this. Now I do usually just start from the left working towards the right, it doesn't matter, but that's just what comes natural. So I'm going to use the 4 middle slots on the top there. So because of the way I add the tape to the wires, they're all more or less lying flat next to each other. So I start from one end of the wires as well, so I don't go to the furthest right wire and bring it over towards the left. So that's what I mean, trying to keep it as consistent and symmetrical and even as possible, really. So I start from the left wire and I'm going to add that into the furthest left slot, in this case starting on the top. Then I grab the next one, and this one I bring down, and then the very next wire from the left I bring up, and then the very next one I bring down. So I'm basically alternating up, down, working from one side towards the other. And now because it's this braid structure, because we kind of have a middle part, what I personally like to do, like I said, this doesn't really matter too much, but I kind of like to do it so if we have a line down the middle, the two halves are mirrored from each other. So the last one I brought into a slot was down, so the next one I'm going to do is also down. And then the next wire in line is up, and then down, and then up. You can also literally just continue to alternate going up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. That's what I do on, say, the diagonal braid structure. But here, because there's a middle to the braid, that's why I like to kind of have a middle to the setup as well, so the two sides are kind of mirrored from each other. So that's how I like to set up my wires, to avoid a big mess in the middle, basically. Because if you grab the first wire from the right and bring it over to a left slot, and then maybe grab a left one and bring it towards the right, you're going to end up with a big mess in the middle. That's, you might not want in the final design in case you need the whole braid and the ends, but also it's just going to make a messy start and maybe harder to kind of see what you're doing. And also you're going to waste a bit of the end of the braid instead of kind of just getting right into it from the beginning. So that's how and why I like to set up my wires like this. So the next part is actually making the braid and how to achieve a tight and even structure to it. Now this is what I've had the most questions about, and also what is the hardest to portray other than face to face. But we're going to give it a go anyway, and hopefully it will help you out. So I have my disc with my wires ready here. Now I haven't started any braiding yet. This is just the beginning of the braid, but it's the same throughout anyway that I do. So first of all, I just want to talk about how I hold the braid. Now I already mentioned that in the beginning here, you grab onto that tape pack, because obviously that's all there is to grab onto. But that means I'm holding onto it literally right below the disc, almost kind of putting my fingers or my thumb a little bit into the hole, but from below. So I'm holding onto the wires, you could say, or the braid eventually when we make some, pretty much as close to the open end of the braid here as possible. And that's what I continue to do throughout. So whenever the braid is going to keep growing here below the disc, I'm going to keep moving my fingers up the braid and holding onto the braid up here still right below the hole in the disc. So the tape part is going to move obviously further down. I'm not going to keep my hands on that because we're going to have no control over it. To have that control is why I then hold on to it literally right below the disc, right below that hole there. So you can always pretty much see my fingers through my thumb, kind of peeking up a little bit through that hole in the disc. That's how I hold on to my braid, like I said, to have the most control over it. Now then, to start moving the wires, this is where we want to make sure to achieve that tightness in the braid and obviously the evenness as well, so we get the whole length of the braid looking as much as the same as possible. So this one I'm going to be doing the cross kumihimo braid structure. And what I do is I take my first wire, like I said, I'm beginning of the braid, that doesn't matter, it's the same throughout, but I released it and I always run it through my fingers first, because you'll find that once you obviously release your wire from the slot, it will have a little bend to it. It'll be a gentle bend, but it is there, and I like to just get rid of that and any other bends there might be. So I always just run it through my fingers, and it also just kind of warms it up and smooths it out. And in this case here, I'm bringing it out to the side, and when I bring a wire from the top or the bottom out to the side, in this case here, obviously I'm just working with my left hand right now, I take my index finger, and then as I'm bringing this out to the side, I'm pushing down on the wire in the middle. So basically get it to lay as flat as possible, going over the top of the other wires that are going to the top and the bottom of the disc, because it's laying on top of them, and then bringing it out to the slot on the side of the disc. Same thing with the other one here, that needs to go out to the opposite side. I release it and then I just run it through my fingers, and as I'm bringing it out towards the side, I take my index finger on my other hand. I've just swapped hands now. I'm still holding on to my braid right below the hole in the disc, but then I push down on my wire in the middle there, on top of the other wires it's crossing over, and then I also kind of straighten it out as I'm bringing it out towards that slot on the side. So right now it's not the easiest to see because it's right at the beginning of the braid, but I'm just going to get a little bit done here. Now I'm going to move the bottom and the top wires over to the opposite sides. So I'm just starting from the bottom because that's where we have the most wires, releasing it, and like before, running it through my fingers. And in this case here, I'm bringing the wire from the bottom towards the top. So I grab onto the wire in my hand, then I use my thumb and I tuck it below, right where the wire is coming out from the open end of the braid there. And then I just kind of flick my wrist. You could say I'm pushing, but I'm not really using a lot of force with this because I'm just supporting the wire from below, and then I'm flicking my wrist so the wire ends up laying over the top of the wire that we crossed out to the side, because that's where these wires are going to be going now. But then doing it so it lays as close to that as possible, and also kind of pushing it a bit in towards the middle. So the wires on the left side here of the disc, if we have a line down through the center, so the bottom two on the left and the top one on the left, in this case here, I'm going to be pushing slightly also in towards the middle there as I'm bringing that one up. I'm releasing the next one, run it through my fingers. In this case, I'm doing the same, but I'm using now my index finger from above, putting that below the wire, and then flicking my wrist downwards. So make sure that this wire lays as flat as possible over the top of the one going out to the side, and also gently pushing it in towards the middle, and then down to fill in that slot on the bottom. The same with the last one on the bottom there. And especially the outer ones, I like to use them to help push things in towards the middle, because that's also what helps create the tightness of the braid. Is all the wires on the left here, I'm pushing in towards the middle in this direction. Now on the right side, I'm going to swap hands, release that first bottom one, straighten it out, and then same thing, but obviously I'm working on the other side now. So put your thumb under it, have a nice tight grip, and then roll it over. Again, push it in towards the middle. So now it's the opposite direction. So we end up having the wires from the left pushing in towards the middle, and the wires from the right pushing in towards the middle. That's going to make the braid tighter, instead of having it too open and loose. And again, the top one here, bring it down, rolling it over, using my index finger. And then the last one on the bottom, roll it using my thumb. So whenever I'm bringing wires from the bottom, I use my thumb to kind of support the wire from behind, and from the top, I use my index finger to support the wire as we're rolling it over. Now, we just need to bring the side wires here back into the structure. So what I always do when I do that is I just do one at a time, smooth it out after releasing it, and I kind of pull at it a little bit, not pull hard, but just gently tugging it a little bit. And then I'm using my index finger, and as I'm starting to push it, bring it down towards the bottom slot there, I'm pushing it against the other wires here that we brought over to the opposite sides and the top and the bottom. That again helps the braid to kind of mush together as much as possible, so we have the least gaps and open space as possible. So just help all the wires mush together, make it nice and tight. Again, other side, using my other hand, push against the side of the braid as I'm bringing the wire down. And that is the first round. So that is how I like to do it. Now what I'm just going to do is make a little bit more, and then just go through it again, and then have a little bit of a closer look. So I now have a bit of braid done here. If we just have a look at the back, you can start to see it come out, and the tape is gradually now moving further down. Obviously not as far yet, it's going to move further, but I'm still holding on to my braid now. I'm moved above the tape, holding on to the braid itself. Again, basically sticking my thumb more or less into the hole from below, and then against my index finger like this. And as you can also see, my thumb from the top there, because like I said, it gives me the most control I feel. So just to go through the movements of the wires again, so you can hopefully really then see it up close. Now I'm just going to start the next round. Remember to smooth out the wire first of all. Then this one is the right one of the two middle ones on the top that goes towards the left side. So remember, I'm taking my index finger here and pushing it down to go straight out to the side there, over the wires to the left of it first of all. So I'm pushing down on that, and then I'm bringing it out to the side and putting it into the slot. And then the other middle one on the top, release it, smooth it out, and then grab onto the wire with your hand, and then with your index finger, as I'm gently kind of tugging at it, push down so it sits as flat as possible over the top of the other wires there, and then out into the slot on the side. Now moving the bottom and the top wires, starting from the bottom here, smooth out the wire, using my thumb to put under. I'm grabbing hold of the wire with my hand, putting my thumb under the wire, and as I'm kind of rolling this over, I'm putting my thumb pretty much as far in as it'll go, rolling it over and also gently pushing it towards the middle, like that, putting it into the slot on the top, and then the top one, same principle, but I'm using my index finger instead. As I'm rolling it, I'm also pushing it in towards the middle. And then the last one on the bottom, using my thumb and doing the same thing. Like that. So you can also see from doing that, you're getting the wires to look kind of curvy from the end of the braid there going into the slot. They're not just a straight line, they kind of have a curve to them. So on this side here, they're curving towards the other side. And then on this side, again, use your thumb underneath, roll it over the other wire going out to the side and push it in towards the middle. Now going against the other wires. Release the top one. Here, use your index finger to roll it and push it in towards the middle. And you can see we get that slight curve in it instead of a straight wire. And the last one, thumb, roll it and push it in towards the middle. And place it into the slot. So you can see the right ones now are curving towards the opposite side as well. So what you might find is that sometimes your wires will overlap a little bit in the middle there, which is perfectly fine as long as you obviously still keep them separate once you start moving the wires. So I know that these two, they are kind of overlapping, but obviously they are on each their own side once we start to use them. But then for the side ones, you can still see I'm holding on to the braid as far up underneath the open end as possible. And the side ones here, I'm just tugging at it slightly. And then as I'm bringing it down, I'm using my index finger to push against the side. And sometimes you'll be able to tell the wires move slightly closer to each other, which is why I do that, is to again tighten up the braid. So get all the wires to sit as tight to each other as possible. Same with the other side. As I'm going to bring it down, I'm just pushing against the side of the braid and then smoothing it out and then brought it down. And now I've done one more round. So that is basically how I like to move my wires, and it is pretty much the same on all the braid structures. So for instance, here I have my wire set up on my disc for the diagonal braid structure, and just to show you around of that as well, how it is the same, but obviously you just got to customize it to the actual braid structure. So here, instead of starting from the middle, I take the top furthest left length, smooth it out, and then this one needs to go over towards the right side. So basically needs to lay over the top of all the other wires that are going to the top and the bottom of the disc. So same principle though as when I'm bringing the other ones to the side, grabbing onto the wire with my hand, using my index finger to push down on the wire as I'm bringing it over the top of the other wires to get it to lay as flat as possible on top of them, and then bringing it out into the side slot. Now for the rest of them is literally bringing them, the bottom ones to the top and the top ones to the bottom, obviously alternating between them. So because the bottom one has the most wires, I'm going to start there, starting furthest to the left, and in this case here, because it's from the bottom, grabbing onto the wire with my hand and then using my thumb, rolling over the top of the wire. So again, it gets as flush to the wire going out to the side as possible, that is going over the top of. And now from the top, so on the first wire I use my left hand, and now for the next one and the remaining ones here I use my right hand, because the one I just used, if I just put this back, I also slightly pushed it a little bit towards the middle like I did before, but not too much. We just kind of brought it over the top of that wire going out to the side. Now for the next one from the top here, use index finger, and as I'm pushing it over the top of the wire going out to the side, I'm also pushing it slightly against the first wire that we literally just brought over. So kind of already tightening those two up against each other. And the next one on the bottom, using my thumb to go underneath. And as I'm rolling that over, I'm again pushing slightly towards the left, again tightening up the braid as I go. So basically the first length I used my left hand and pushed it slightly towards the right. The rest I'm pushing towards the left to kind of tighten all them up towards that very first wire. And each one I'm doing the same thing. Top one, use the index finger. Make sure it gets as tight as possible. And the last one on the bottom, use your thumb to roll it over. And again, you can see doing that, we get these curves instead of straight lines of wire out. And you can see the first one, the first two there on the top are kind of overlapping, but that's because the very first one obviously is curving in the opposite direction. But again, just make sure to keep them separated when you're making the braid, and it's absolutely fine. The one on the side, now we just have one, but it's the same principle. In this case, I'm taking hold of the wire and then my index finger, same principle as I'm bringing it down, I'm pushing on the side of the disc, not the disc, sorry, the side of the braid, to again make sure to help close up and tighten up these wires in the middle, and then bringing that down. And now we have all the wires in this braid structure back in the original position. So as you can see, exactly the same basic methods. I'm just slightly customizing them to whatever braid structure that I'm using, because obviously here we have one wire on the side, whereas the one we did before we had two. So that's the only thing that's different, but the actual movements of the wires are exactly the same. I'm using the rolling motion, making sure to get everything as tight as possible. So we end up with these slightly curved wires instead of straight wires. So again, also just to mention, I am holding the braid right underneath the open end as much as I can. So again, you can see my thumb kind of poking through there to have the most control over the braid. So what I thought I would just do as well is show you, if you don't use the technique of moving the wires like I showed you, how it could end up looking. So I just started a braid here using some craft wire in a bright color so you can see it nicely. I've already made a length using the technique I showed you before, where you get the braid nice and tight and even, as you can see. So now what I'm going to do is basically move the wires more freely, almost as if it was cord, because if you're using cord to make kumihimo with, if you've done that before, you're familiar with the fact that you can just move it without worrying about really the tightness there in the middle the way I showed you, because the cord will just naturally nestle together, whereas the wire obviously acts quite differently. So I'll just basically start moving the wires here as if I'm using cord more or less. I'm not worrying about getting everything in the middle tight and rolling over and bringing wires tight together like I showed you before. Now bear with me, because the other way for me is such a habit, it's ingrained into me by now. I'm likely to I catch myself doing it regardless, but I'm gonna try and just basically here, as you can see, I'm moving the wire without rolling it tight over the wire, and also the side ones, instead of pushing on the side there, just bring them down. And I'll just do this for a little bit. As you can see here, I'm just moving the wires freely as if it was cord, and then like I said, I'll do it for a bit and we'll have a look at what the braid looks like, also in contrast with the other end of it. So this is the first part of the braid where I used the technique that I showed you about getting it nice and tight and even as well. So this is the result, and this is about 0.6 mil wire, just for reference. So obviously different thicknesses of wire will have different results, but so this is pretty fine to use for kumihimo. But then moving up to where I kind of just did it loosely as if I was using cord, you can see the drastic difference in the braid. So it's much more open and also much more uneven, and it's much harder to keep it even on purpose when you try, because it's so open and you don't have that control as in moving the wires exactly where you want them to go instead of where the wires just naturally go. So you can see the difference here. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this. This will be fine for certain designs or doing certain things. I'm just saying this is the difference between the technique of how I get my braids tight and even like this compared to, say, kind of doing it as if you were using cord and just kind of letting it get open like this. So you can see it's more uneven as well. So it's just to show you the difference between the two methods. Now then, finally, I just want to give you a few tips that I've found after making quite a bit of wire kumihimo now. So first of all is the type of wire to use. Now personally, what I use and prefer is a copper-based wire. Now this is silver-coated copper wire, but it's still copper wire. And it's soft, so I highly recommend using soft wire for wire kumihimo because it's just easier and you don't have to worry about the soft wire being too soft because you're first of all using many lengths of it, which add strength, and also you're braiding them in and interweaving them, which is also going to add more strength to the braid itself. And obviously you're moving the wire, which will harden the wire as it's being used. So my recommendation all the way is to use soft wire because you'll still end up with strong enough braids, but also braids you can shape after you've done the braid more easily than if it was hard wire. Plus, using harder wire than soft wire, would be much harder to work with for your fingers and being able to get the tightness as well. So that's why I highly recommend using soft wire. Now I also just want to recommend specific tools that I recommend very highly, and that is some fine pliers. So these are chain nose pliers and round nose pliers, but they are more fine than your usual typical ones. These are the Suron brand. I highly recommend these regardless. I use these all the time, but especially for wire kumihimo they are very useful because if we start with the tweezer nose here, the chain nose pliers, they are finer than your typical ones, but they still have great grip. And the reason for the fact that they're finer makes them really good is, for instance, here, have a braid. Sometimes, either by making the braid or if you're adding beads or something, you need to move some wires in here on this open end of the braid. And it can be a bit difficult to get in there sometimes with your fingers, whether it's thicker gauge wire because it's harder to move, or it's finer gauge like this, and it's just really hard to get into the specific area and move that wire. That's where these come in. So they are brilliant for basically going in and grabbing a very specific place, a wire if you just need to move it a little bit, or like I said, if you're adding beads as well and you need to maneuver some wires to make space for the beads or something, these pliers are very handy for that because they are fine but still grip really well. So I highly recommend them. And then the round nose pliers they do as well because the tips are very fine, finer than your usual round nose pliers. And the reason that I recommend them is you'll find if you have my book for wire kumihimo, for some designs I end up using the braid itself. You can see even though we get a tight structure, there's still gaps because that's just the nature of wire. You can't get it 100% tight. Now for some designs, what I actually do is use some of these gaps mainly on the edges for the design, and sometimes using these round nose pliers to just go in and open up those gaps a little bit more to basically help get the wire through more easily, or if you just need to open them up to be able to get something else through, like a head pin or something. And that basically, I'm able to do that with these specific Suron round nose pliers, but I'm not able to do that with regular round nose pliers. So again, I highly recommend these specifically for that reason. And overall, they're just great pliers that I use all the time anyway. So hopefully this video was helpful for you if you struggled with some of the wire kumihimo designs, either from my book here if you have that, or any other tutorials of mine. I really hope this covers most, if not all, of the questions there might be. So don't forget, the description box below the video there will have any information and links that you might need, including for the book, also a signed copy if you would like that. Otherwise, I really hope this was useful for you and that you enjoyed it, but thank you so much for watching it, and I'll see you in the next one.